Very good. So 2 minutes past it is, and let's make a start. Good. Well, once again, welcome to this evening's session. I'm gratified to see some names that I don't recognise from previous events. So for those of you who know about the Insiders Outsiders project, I hope you'll bear with me if I just say a few brief words of introduction to the project. It started off life as an in-person, year-long nationwide festival that embraced all the arts, but essentially was paying tribute in a nuanced and more detailed and sometimes critical way to the immense contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to British culture. COVID kicked in, if that's the word, just as the festival was ending, and luckily for me, I have to say, and we went online, as many people did, and this session tonight forms part of an ongoing series of online events which continue to explore an always fascinating and always more to be discovered about topic. And I have to say, rather to my shame, this is the first, I think I'm right, this is the first talk that is actually quite explicitly and primarily or exclusively focused on those who ended up in Northern Ireland. We have plans in the pipeline, and I wanted immediately, before I forget, to say thank you both to Bernie Enlander, who's with us tonight, and also Stephen Jaffe, who grew up, I believe I'm right in saying, in Northern Ireland, although they're now based in London. But I first came across, or my interest was whetted in the subject by a talk that Bernie gave way back, I think, in January of this year. And I then got in touch with Bernie, who put me in touch with Stephen Jaffe. And I think they in turn, Michael, I think I'm right, suggested that you get in touch with me to give a talk for Insiders Outsiders. So I think I mustn't go on too much, but we have plans in the pipeline for other events that will explore the Irish side of the story. So watch this space, as they say, and I will say more about that later. Anyway, it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker for this evening, Michael Lewis, and I'll say a little bit about him by way of introduction. He was born in Belfast in just after the war in 1949. He read modern languages at Oxford and teacher training course in York. He taught for many a long year, 35 years, in comprehensive schools, mainly modern languages, becoming the head teacher of the King Edward VII School in Sheffield between an impressive length of time, Michael, between 1988 and 2008. But retirement didn't stop you from being active. Far from it. He served for 14 years as a lay employment tribunal member, as a member of the Teaching Regulation Agency Teacher Conduct Panel, and a member of the Independent Ethics Panel of South Yorkshire Police. The University of Sheffield awarded him an honorary degree as a Doctor of Letters. He lives in Sheffield. He's married to Petra, has 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. But for our purpose tonight, most importantly, he is the son of the 2 wonderful people he's going to be talking about: The Refugee and The Survivor, A Family Story. So over to you, Michael. I'm going to absent myself, and you'll tell me when you want to start showing images.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming along. This is a story of my parents, the refugee, my father, and the survivor, the Holocaust, my mother. And my mother told her story in a memoir called A Time to Speak that some of you will know, that was published first in 1992. The refugee in this presentation is my father, and up till now, his story hasn't been told. So I think, Monica, if you can show slides of my mother and father, just so that we can start off now.
Right, how does that look? All good? Yep.
That's the introduction. And next couple of slides
there we go.
Right, so this is my father, around about the age of 37, taken after the war in 1946. And the next slide is a picture of my mother, taken the year that A Time to Speak was published in 1992. So I'd like to start off with 2 key dates which transformed the lives of millions of people, my parents included, and sets the scene for what I'm going to talk about. So the first slide here is a notorious picture. It dates from the 30th of September 1938, the Munich Agreement between Hitler and Mussolini, and the French Prime Minister Daladier and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. And the agreement was essentially to dismember the Democratic Republic of Czechoslovakia, which was an ally of Britain. And the day after, the 1st of October, 1938, the Sudetenland, the border area, was incorporated into the Großdeutsches Reich, Greater Germany. And with it, 3 million or so German speakers, including my parents, who were, of course, as well as being German speakers, Jewish. And the second critical date, if we can have a look, please. We've got the next slide. The 15th of March, 1939, the remainder of what was Czechoslovakia was occupied by Nazi forces. You may recognize the entrance to the castle that overlooks Prague. This was the end of Czechoslovakia. It became the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and Slovakia had gone its own way. So to pick up the story, who were Harry and Helen? Where did they come from? And how did they end up in Belfast? Well, they were both born in the same little town on the northern edge of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the so-called Sudetenland. And I think we should have a map. Next slide. So this is actually courtesy of the Wiener Library. Dates from 1938, and the Sudetenland are the border areas to the north and the west. It's described as Greater Germany, but to the north today, Poland, Wrocław, today Polish city, then Breslau and Silesia. To the northwest, Saxony, to the immediate west, Bavaria, and the country that doesn't exist anymore on this slide, Austria, with the capital Vienna, which by this stage had been incorporated into Greater Germany. This is where my parents came from. And as I say, they were German speakers. But they were not German by nationality, but by cultural affinity. And they came from a little town called Trautenau. You won't find it on a map if you look, because it doesn't exist as Trautenau anymore. It's called Trutnov. It's an hour and a half northeast of Prague, and there is no German-speaking community there at all. So my mother was born Helene Katz in 1916. She was the grandchild of a station master on the Austrian railways. An uncle of hers fought in the First World War, in the Great War, for the Austrian Kaiser, and died a prisoner of the Russians in Rostov-on-Don in 1917. Her family ran a shop selling fashion goods. Her school education was entirely in German. My father was born Leon Harry Lewy, and I will use the German pronunciation at this point, in 1909. He went to the same school as my mother, and his family originated from the Baltic, from what is now Lithuania, but was then the borderland between the German and Russian empires. In 1890, Max, my grandfather, emigrated to South Africa in search of gold and diamonds. And in 1906, he returned to Europe from South Africa, sadly, without any gold or diamonds, but something that turned out to be much, much more precious, and that was a British passport. He settled in Trautenau and became a flax merchant. And the area in Austria-Hungary, as it then was, later Czechoslovakia, was a flax growing area. And flax, the core plant in the production of linen, meant that there was actually a commercial link, an industrial link with Northern Ireland, Belfast, and the Lagan Valley. So even before the First War, there were connections between the two territories. In 1918, Austria-Hungary ceased to exist. It disintegrated the empire, and Czechoslovakia was born from the Treaty of Versailles and subsequent treaties, with a number of important minorities: Polish, Hungarian, German, Roma, and Jewish. The Lewy and Katz families were both Jewish, part of a tiny community in Trautenau. Helen had a secular upbringing with little evidence of Jewish religious practice or belief. And I've stressed practice and belief are not the same as identity. The sense of identity was always there. Later, in the 30s, she moved to Prague to train to be a choreographer and a dancer, and encountered Czech culture for the first time, which she embraced with great enthusiasm. Unlike the Katz family, the Levys kept a kosher household. I wonder if we could just maybe see the next slide, which should show the Levy family. So here on left and right, my grandmother and my grandfather, and the two boys standing in the middle, Harry, the taller of the two, aged about 12, and his younger brother, Arthur. So they kept a kosher household, attended synagogue, and were generally what we would say call more observant. Harry, the first in his family to go to university, studied international trade in Vienna and then commerce and economics in Florence in Italy. It's quite a complicated background, and Helen, my mother, discusses this issue of identity, who these people were, her family, the Levy family, in A Time to Speak. And I'll just read you a brief extract. And she writes, this would have been around 1932, she's describing. At school, I became more aware of serious divisions in our national and religious life. I was Jewish, but less Jewish than some of my friends whose families observed Jewish laws and rituals much more strictly. I was also German, but not the same fervently German nationalistic types as some of my classmates. My home was the Democratic Republic of Czechoslovakia. My mother tongue was German. My religion was Jewish. And both families regarded themselves as well settled, integrated, assimilated. She goes on, from 1933, the first reverberations from across the border reached the German communities of Czechoslovakia and permeated every sphere of life. And what happened to my parents was determined solely by their Jewish identity. Harry and Helen knew each other from childhood. As I say, they both went to the same school, they lived near each other. And at some point, I think in the 30s, a romance developed, followed by a breakup. And they went their separate ways. And I'll come to Helen's story, but first of all, I'd like to talk about Harry. So the next slide should show a very abbreviated CV. Okay, so what I've already told you a bit of, born in 1909, 1932 to 38, he comes back from his studies abroad and works in the linen industry, the textile industry, not far from home. Flees to Britain, is a refugee, is naturalized, changes his name by deed poll to Lewis, and dies at the age of 82 in Belfast. Well, that's obviously very abbreviated, but it gives you a bit of background. So back to the story. On the day Hitler and Chamberlain signed their agreement at Munich to transfer the Sudetenland, Harry was working in his office in Reichenberg. Don't look for Reichenberg because that doesn't exist either on any maps. It's now called Liberec, was the main city in the Sudetenland. And he knew from that evening onwards that as a Jew, he and indeed his family had no future there. And that very evening, the night of the Chamberlain-Hitler agreement, he fled across the border into what remains of Czechoslovakia. And that's where my book starts. It opens with the following. Herr Doctor, it is really time to leave. Ignaz, caretaker, agitated, stood at the office doorway, shifting from foot to foot. There is no time to waste. It's ugly. It'll be dark in an hour. You can't stay a minute longer. Dr. Leon Harry Levy, 29, unmarried, average height, slightly overweight, already thinning greying hair, said nothing. Please, Herr Doctor, pleaded Ignaz. You need to get away. Oh, thank you, Ignaz. I've just got a couple of letters to write. And I won't be long, and I'd like to make a quick telephone call to Liesel, his then girlfriend. It's not safe, Herr Doctor. Come over here, listen. And Ignaz opened the office window. In the distance, Harry could make out a vague rumbling, which, as he listened harder, became the unmistakable rhythmic beat of a martial drumming. A chant, Juda verrecke, Judah, perish, death to the Jews, echoed in the narrow streets. And that same evening, Harry made good his escape, hiding under a tarpaulin on the back of a lorry, reaching the safety of the nearest main Czech town, Dvorkalove, Königenhof in Germany. And a few days later, on the 4th of October, he was joined by his bewildered and frightened parents. And they too had fled from their family and the family home, which was now part of Greater Germany. And they were never to see that home again. And I think we can see a slide of it. In the next slide, please. So this is the house that they left. They never saw it again. This is a photograph from 10 years ago. It's still standing. It was in Reichstraße, in Empire Street. The street is now called Poland Street, Polska. No great surprise, maybe. So in the following weeks, in Dvorkalove, they debate what are they going to do. Max and Minna have British passports following Max's exploits in South Africa. Harry and his brother Arthur, however, are immediately at risk. Harry's not convinced, although Max thinks they'll just sit it out. On the 9th of November 1938, Max is in Prague and has an interview at the British consulate to try and get passports for his sons. Well, things didn't go well. I'm very sorry indeed, sir, but I do not see that there is much more that His Majesty's government can do to assist at present. The rules are quite clear. I'm a loyal British citizen, Max replied. Surely that counts for something in these difficult times. Oh, yes, indeed it does. Indeed it does. You and Mrs. Levy have every right to travel to the United Kingdom whenever you wish. And my sons? What's going to happen to them? As I have explained, the official replied, labouring his studied patience, His Majesty will consider you and your wife welcome whenever you choose. But Harry, Arthur, that is an entirely different matter. As you well know, they are citizens of Czechoslovakia. Much as I would like to assist you, Mr. Levy, I cannot simply issue British passports to anyone who presents himself at His Majesty's embassy claiming to be in some sort of danger. Furthermore, he added after a brief pause, as I have already explained to you, neither son was born in the United Kingdom, nor in one of its dominions or colonies. As far as His Majesty's government is concerned, they are foreigners, the foreign-born sons of a naturalised British subject. They have no entitlement to a British passport and no automatic right to enter the United Kingdom, even if they're in danger. Danger? Aren't we perhaps exaggerating a little? Perhaps another country might be prepared to grant entry, even citizenship. I'm told that Uruguay is open to such arrangements in exchange for an appropriate fee. I assume that wouldn't be a problem for a prosperous gentleman like yourself, Mr. Levy. Well, as Max was pleading in vain for help, events occurred that settled any hesitation he and Minna might have had. The 9th of November 1938 was, of course, what became known as Reich Pogromnacht, Kristallnacht, and the Jewish communities of Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland were devastated. In Trautenau, the synagogue was burnt down. And if we just have a look at the next slide, please. This is the synagogue. It's an interesting picture. The building dates from 1882, from what in German is sometimes called the Gründerjahre, the foundation years. It was a small community, but it was confident. It felt it had a future, and this building reflects that. It was razed to the ground, burnt to the ground on the 9th and 10th of November 1938, and there is no synagogue in Trutnov anymore. So by February, having realised there would be no return, Harry finds himself living a precarious clandestine existence in Prague, assembling the documents needed to leave the country. The Czech authorities have become hostile to the influx of German-speaking refugees and political refugees, Jewish or otherwise, first from Germany, then from Austria after Anschluss, and now from within their own country. Laws have been passed. Harry risks arbitrary arrest and forced labour, or even deportation. So he has to collect documents, and here is a slide of one of these documents. I don't know how this has survived. It's a Zeugnis, a record, testimony that he doesn't actually have a criminal record, which is no great surprise, but it was one of the many documents that needed to be assembled, and I have no idea how this one survived. But it shows that, at least on that point, they could let him go or even travel through Germany. So on the 15th of March, the day that the Germans occupied Prague, Harry began his final preparations. And a few days later, he made his way from his hiding place in Prague to Wilson Station, the main railway station, to take the train through Germany and the Netherlands to England and freedom. All around him, the centre of Prague, fluttered Nazi flags, the swastika. German troops were everywhere. At the entrance of the station, he experienced the first of what were to be many interrogations. Papers demanded an official voice as he entered the main hall. Destination: Hook van Holland, via Frankfurt and Cologne, then London, replied Harry, trying to make it sound as if this was a routine journey he'd undertaken many times. Harry threaded his way through the crowds. A large trestle table formed a barrier behind which sat 2 uniformed German officers and a civilian. Behind them, guarding access to the platform, 2 more soldiers. To either side, Harry noticed 1 or 2 figures. Stereotypical images of plainclothes policemen, he thought, as if borrowed directly from the local cinema. The queue moved slowly forward. From time to time, the stereotypes identified individual travellers for further questioning. Random suitcases were selected for detailed inspection, which entailed rough rummaging, tipping out of contents on the floor of the station, a visible intimidation and humiliation. And then it was Harry's turn. Destination. He repeated the answer. Documents, demanded the Czech civilian. Passport, police clearance papers, currency declaration, suitcase contents, dated Reich transit documents, entrance papers to Holland, train tickets, seat reservation. Open your cases, Lewy. Harry did as instructed. List of contents. He presented the carefully handwritten list. 2 pairs of shoes, 1 black, 1 brown. 2 suits, 1 brown, 1 dark blue. 1 Czech, 1 Italian. 3 shirts, 2 cotton, 1 linen. 3 ties, all silk. 2 sets of cufflinks, silver. And your valuables: gold, diamonds, works of art, stamp collections, large denomination currency. No, nothing of that kind. Forbidden materials, enemy propaganda, books, weapons. Well, I have a few books with me just for private use. Take them out. He fished them out and put them on the trestle table. And there we have it, gentlemen, sneered one of the Germans seated next to the Czech official. The ruthless, cosmopolitan, Jewish intellectual. Pack them back in your case. And then turning to the others, he said, who cares what this damn Jew reads? And so, in the final days of March 1939, my father embarked on his perilous train journey through Nazi Germany and the Netherlands. And the book charts that nerve-wracking journey, his arrival in Harwich, in England, where his new life as a refugee in a foreign country really begins. So what was it like to be a refugee? Well, helpfully, if we can have a look at the next slide, please. The committee had produced helpful information and guidance for every refugee while you're in England. This book is or pamphlet is in English and on the facing page in German. and I've picked out one or two particularly helpful phrases. Do not talk in a loud voice. Do not criticize any government regulations. Do not make yourself conspicuous by speaking loudly, nor by your manner or dress. The Englishman greatly dislikes ostentation or unconventionality. The Englishman attaches very great importance to modesty, understatement in speech rather than overstatement, and quietness. The Englishman values good manners. So this was the helpful advice that refugees fleeing to the United Kingdom were given. It wasn't all like that. At Paddington, Harry found the bus stop for a double-decker, which was filling up with passengers. He made his way to the upper deck, taking a seat next to the window. A middle-aged man sat down next to him. Going far? The man asked. Belsize Park, replied Harry. Mind if I ask where you come from? Asked the man who had noticed Harry's accent in just the two words uttered. Harry hesitated. How much explanation should he give? Would protectorate suffice? He loathed the Nazi terminology imposed on his country. Czechoslovakia, he answered, conscious that he sounded German. I see, continued the man. Harry had grown used to these kinds of conversations, which usually ended with a non-committal, oh, I see. On this occasion, the conversation took a rather different turn. I am so terribly sorry. What our government did was a betrayal. The Munich Agreement is shameful. Harry was taken aback. Political discussions did not usually take place on the upper deck of London buses. We're all paying the price now, continued the stranger, inquiring, do you personally know the Sudetenland? Yes, that's where I come from, Harry replied, not really wanting to prolong the conversation. But I'm a refugee now. I see, came the answer, as expected. The journey to Belsize Park didn't take long, and Harry got to his feet, saying, excuse me, please, as he slipped into the aisle. I am so very, very sorry about what has happened to your country, answered the man, and pressed a crumpled piece of paper into Harry's hand. Carefully manoeuvring himself down the stairs as the bus drew to a halt, Harry glanced at the paper. It was a 10-shilling note, a fortune. Harry was utterly bewildered. So, Flight from Prague tells of his life, of loneliness, of separation from friends and family. He was never again to see his brother Arthur, of unending uncertainty, of hope and despair, on being on the edge of destitution, a permanent limbo. He was no longer subject to fear of arbitrary arrest, but he was an alien, living in the twilight, and he had to report regularly to the police and the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia. Towards the end of writing the book, and in the course of research, my brother came across a document in the National Archive in Kew, bearing Harry's name, and sealed until 2030. That was quite exciting. But it was quickly released under freedom of information and shed precious light on the life of a refugee. It's essentially a record of a series of interviews or interrogations, and some of the key facts that emerge are really important. He was penniless. They ask him, what's he living on? What are his means? And there's a blank, a dash. He has no means. And he's given a small allowance to eke out his existence. They ask him, on what grounds, why has he come to the United Kingdom? He explains that, as they can tell from his name, he's Jewish. And they write on the document, racial, the official categorization for Harry. They ask about how long he's staying. He's been granted permission provided he's in transit to the United States. And at the end, after one of these interviews, there's a talk about a job. And he has a job offer from Northern Ireland with a proviso that no British worker is available to do the work. So that's his life in London. And on the 1st of September, 1939, the day that Nazi Germany invades Poland, his parents arrive in England, protected by their British passports. And a couple of months later, they make their way to Belfast, and the local Jewish community finds some rooms in North Belfast, in a street called Lantane Street, which no longer exists. And shortly after that, Harry finds himself in the centre of Belfast in Linenhall Street, on his way to an interview for a job. Harry walked across the office towards the voice that had said, "Come in." Its owner, a balding, thick-set man in short sleeves, was engrossed in a ledger and didn't look up at the visitor for some time. Harry stood awkwardly by the desk. "And you're Mr. Levy, I assume?" he finally inquired without making eye contact. "Yes, Dr. Levy, Dr. Harry Levy. Sir, I understand you have a position vacant." "Yes, we have. One of our chaps is off to the Navy. Got to keep the business going somehow, war effort and all that." "I have a letter here about you." "Ah, yes, it says you're warmly recommended, that you're reliable, intelligent, quite knowledgeable about textiles, a hard worker. Is that you, Mr. Levy?" "Yes, sir." "When can you start?" "I can start immediately, sir, if that would be acceptable to you." Harry replied, wondering whether he sounded just too obsequious or maybe just polite. He'd been advised that the British always address their superiors, or even strangers, as sir. "Perfect," said Mr. Hillis. 9 o'clock, Monday morning. We can discuss your duties and remuneration then." "Thank you very much, sir. I am very grateful." "Well, that's that. Monday the 13th. And remember to bring all your documents. And don't forget the one with the RUC stamp. Oh, and one last thing. We don't need any of that fancy doctor stuff here. You'll just be plain Mr. Louis." Well, as it turned out, Harry worked for that company, the County Iron Weaving, later called Manufacturing Company, for 30 years, and lived in Belfast for the next 52 years. In 1949, he became Harry Lewis. He never forgot he'd been a refugee, an outcast, and would joke occasionally that he was just a bloody foreigner. But Belfast became his home, a place of safety and a place of security for him and later for his family. So that's a very brief summary of what's in the book and how Harry came to Belfast. My mother is the survivor in this story, and if we could maybe just have a look, please, Monica, at her CV briefly. Oh, sorry, that's the document. Whoops, move on, please, from National Archives. So this is an abbreviated CV. She was Helene Katz, became Herrmann through marriage, then Levy through marriage, then Lewis. Critical date, 1938, she married her first husband. 4 years later, in August 42 and until May 44, she was incarcerated in Terezin, Theresienstadt, ghetto concentration camp. In 1944, in May, deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. In July, as a slave laborer to Stutthof. Forced onto a death march, liberated by the Red Army, she returned to Prague in 1945. And 2 years later, married my father. And she lived till the age of 93 and died at the end of 2009 in Belfast. So that's just a very brief summary. So on the 15th of March, the day that the Germans invaded, Helen was living in Prague, recently married, pursuing a very promising career as a professional dancer. Anti-Jewish laws were introduced almost immediately to isolate the Jewish population. Travel, public spaces, work were all restricted. The racial laws began to be applied. Money, property, pets, even pets, were confiscated. Helen and her husband contemplated fleeing, but that would have meant they had to leave their parents behind, and that was out of the question. However, as we all know, some did get away on the now celebrated Kindertransport, and she comments on this. We found Paul's parents, Paul, her husband, his parents desolate. Paul's sister Julie, along with her little son Peter, had been forced onto the last train to London by her father-in-law. She and Paul had been very close, and I loved her as if she was my own sister, and we hadn't even been able to say goodbye. It was a measure of our ignorance of things to come that we considered this episode a tragedy. And I'll just comment here, we of course know the story with hindsight. The description here doesn't. And this event, the Kindertransport, it was a tragedy. She continues in A Time to Speak. In 1941, the daily onslaught of vicious anti-Semitism had prepared the ground for a new anti-Jewish law that made all previous laws appear like harmless games. The introduction of the yellow star, to be worn in public at all times by all Jews over the age of 6. And from that moment, we were visible targets for anyone who chose to attack or abuse us. The next slide shows a group. You can see that they're wearing the star. This is a wedding photograph from October 1941, and the lady holding the flowers called Lewy Katz, and she has just married the gentleman next to her, Erwin, who was my mother's uncle, I beg your pardon. And the lady in the light-coloured coat is my mother. Next to her, Paul, her husband, and next to him, the small lady, my grandmother, my mother's mother. Interesting that the photograph was taken. Of the people in the photograph, it is only my mother who is known to have survived the Holocaust. So if we can move on. So Paul, her husband, my mother, photograph from 1992, and my grandmother, Elsa. In mid-1942, harassment and persecution began to be accompanied by mass deportations. And Elsa, my grandmother, was deported to Terezin, Theresienstadt, just north of Prague, and today on the tourist trail. Tourist trail. And from there, she was taken further east to Lublin in eastern Poland and gassed at Sobibor, a camp which had a sole purpose, extermination. The details of my grandmother's death, time, day, date, circumstances are not known and never will be. And an estimated 250,000 people died in Sobibor alone. On the 10th of August, it was Helen and Paul's turn to be deported. And the next slide is a deportation list. This gives an insight into the inner workings. My mother's been given a code number 677, Paul 676. And although you probably can't see it, for reasons that we will never know, her occupation is given as Krankenschwester, nurse. We don't know how and why. Maybe it sounded better than Tänzerin, dancer, or choreographer. But this was one of the lists of the thousands and thousands of people deported to Terezin. And it was given to my brother and myself by the curator of the museum in Terezin 10 years ago. And it was the first of 3 concentration and extermination camps that my mother spent years in. And Terezin is well known. It was a former fortress, emptied in November 1941 of its garrison and civil population, and used as a collection point for Jews from Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and the Czech lands. Over 90,000 people were deported from Terezin to the east to extermination camps. Very few survived. A lot has been written about Terezin, and it is famous and notorious for its artistic life. But over 33,000 people died there, mainly of illness or starvation. It was a place of immense suffering and death. My mum describes her arrival. We had to walk for more than 2 hours, carrying our luggage in the scorching August sun. The horror of that march under armed SS guard was a fitting start to what was to come. Paul and I were separated. He went to the men's barracks. I dragged my case to the room on Q Street, my new home. There were 30 of us in one room, lying on bare floorboards. In the first days after our arrival in Terezin, I had pronounced that the food from the kitchen was so revolting it was inedible. By the time I started work in the children's home, the Kinderheim, the quality of the food didn't matter. All I cared about was its availability. And starvation was the reality for all inmates throughout the camp system, one of many mechanisms for doing them to death. In my mum's case, when the war ended, grown woman in her late 20s, she weighed less than 30 kilos. And she describes her work in the children's home. It was impossible to restore to the children the feelings of security that they'd lost, and the 1 hour a day that they could spend with their parents only aggravated their sense of being abandoned. They knew very well that theirs was not a normal childhood. Over 15,000 children passed through the ghetto. Most were murdered. Well, after nearly 2 years there, it was her and Paul's turn to be deported to Auschwitz. She writes, "If we'd ever thought that 2 years in Terezin had left us sufficiently tough to bear any hardship, the first few minutes on the train taught us otherwise. We travelled in conditions designed to inflict the greatest possible suffering. Many panicked, others wept, and so others slumped into silent despair." And in Auschwitz, she was given another identity. She became EB1206. We arrived from Terezin on the 20th of May, 1944. Until that date, we knew nothing of extermination camps or death chambers. We had been told we were going to a labour camp. I'll just remind you, we read our history backwards. We know what happened. Even after 2 years in Terezin and 4 years of Nazi occupation, she says she didn't know and hadn't heard. Before Auschwitz, I had never seen anybody wearing a tattoo. The tattooing was not painful, but there was a dreadful finality to the act. And in that, of course, she was correct. The number A4772 was inked on her left forearm for the rest of her life. It didn't define her, but it did mark her. A few weeks later, D-Day, 6th of June, Nazi policy changed, was modified, and those fit enough to be slaves were selected by Dr. Mengele, the notorious camp doctor, and sent to work. Paul was sent to a sub-camp of Sachsenhausen, a place called Schwarzheide near Dresden, and Helen never saw him again. And she herself was sent to Stutthof, near present-day Gdansk in Poland, then Danzig, to build an airfield for the Luftwaffe as the Soviets advanced towards Berlin. While this was happening, mass extermination of the Hungarian Jews, over 400,000, was taking place in Auschwitz. Stutthof is less well known than many camps, but more than 60,000 people are estimated to have died there and in its satellite camps, and many more were to perish on the marches following evacuation in January. The names of the famous camps, the notorious camps, are well known. There were over 40,000 concentration and concentration satellite camps in the Nazi Empire. An extraordinary number. She writes, Stutthof didn't display its machinery of death as openly as Auschwitz, but it existed all the same, and we knew it. To be caught late for roll call was an offence punishable by ritual beating administered in the evening. The beatings took place in front of the whole camp and degraded those who had to watch as much as those who suffered them. And that was her life for months on end. Many died of starvation or exhaustion. Others, too weak to work, were sent to the main gas chamber in Stutthof main camp. And yet, extraordinarily, there was resistance. Yom Kippur was approaching when word went round to celebrate this holiest of Jewish days, and the whole camp would stage a unique act of defiance. We would fast all day for the prescribed 24 hours. And astonishingly, everybody agreed. The Oberaufseherin, the chief SS woman supervisor, was furious at such unheard of defiance and responded with a counter threat. If we fasted, not only would we work as normal, but there would be no food at the end of the working day. The new unexpected solidarity made us feel strong. And so she continued into the bitter winter, knowing that it was only a matter of time. She did not expect to survive. But she did survive through a remarkable combination of circumstances, and on the 27th of January, the day that Auschwitz was liberated, she, and along with those prisoners who were still able to walk, were forced out of the camp by the SS on what later became known as a death march. And she escaped from that, initially hiding in a snow-filled ditch, and was later rescued by Soviet soldiers. And after treatment in a Red Army field hospital, she discharged herself at the end of May. The war had ended, against medical advice, and made her way across war-devastated Poland back to Prague, arriving on the 4th of June, after travelling for many days and nights. And she writes, at midnight, we arrived in Prague. We almost fell out of the train, and with our last strength made our way to the Red Cross Centre. The nurse on night duty was about to pack up. We begged her for a cup of tea, but she said there wasn't any at that hour. We told her where we'd come from. How long were you in concentration camps for? Asked the nurse. 3 years. Well, if you stuck it out there for 3 years, you'll survive one night without tea. And she closed up. And so we bedded down on the stone floor and spent our first night at home. Well, that is a hugely abridged account of what is in A Time to Speak. But I'd like to conclude with a few observations. My mother and father were exceptional. I want to explain what I mean. My mother survived the Holocaust. 90% of Jews in the Czech lands, nearly 90%, were murdered or perished. My father succeeded in becoming a refugee. The majority who wanted to become refugees and get away failed and died. And in that sense, the story of Harry and Helen is a story of exceptions. The Holocaust, as you know, of course, was the extreme end of a spectrum of dehumanization, which begins with seeing others as not quite like us. And one of the reasons for telling this story is not just out of respect for the suffering of the past and of my family, but as an obligation to make sure that present and future generations know as well. So to conclude, what happened next? If we could just look at the next slide, please. Well, in June 1947, my parents got married in Prague Town Hall. My dad, by this stage, was a naturalized British citizen. And Helen came to Ireland, not as a refugee, but as the wife of a British citizen. And in 1949, shortly before I was born, the Levys became the Lewises, and their future lay in Belfast. And Harry lived there, as I said, for 50 years, Helen for over 60. The outsiders over time became insiders. And Helen was widely recognized for her contribution to life in her new home. She became a sort of establishment figure, at least in the world of the arts. In the background, sustaining and supporting her throughout her recovery and rehabilitation, her artistic work and creativity and family life was Harry. The next slide is a blue plaque, you can see, outside the Crescent Arts Centre in Belfast, where Helen was patron and where there is a dance studio in her name. And it honours the memory of Honorary Dr. Helen Lewis, MBE. So I'd like to conclude with a very short poem by Michael Longley, celebrated poet and close family friend. Michael died earlier this year. He wrote a number of poems inspired by my mother's story. And shortly before he died, he gave me permission to include a linen handkerchief at the end of my book, Flight from Prague. And it's the only poem in which he talks about both my mother and my father. The story I've told you today is, of course, amongst many other things, a story of love. And Michael captures its essence beautifully in 8 sparse lines. So this is a linen handkerchief for Helen Lewis by Michael Longley. Northern Bohemia's flax fields and the flax fields of Northern Ireland, the linen industry brought Harry, trader in linen handkerchiefs, to Belfast. And then, after Terezin and widowhood and Auschwitz, you, Odysseus, as a girl, your sail, a linen handkerchief, on which he embroidered and unpicked hundreds of names, all through the wall. But in one corner, the flowers encircling your name never came undone. And that's the story of my parents, the refugee and the survivor. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was, well, what can I say? I think everybody will echo my feeling that this was hugely moving. Lots of resonances with, I think, perhaps many of us in the audience, certainly my own family history. Was there one more? Was that it? Was there a last slide or not? I think
No,
it
I
gave,
think the last slide maybe is simply a
it gave
reference.
the details. There we are. Those are the details of
Yeah.
the 2 books. Your book has just come out. The other one, I think, probably out of print, but still available.
No,
And Mother's
it's
book.
just been reprinted.
Just been reprinted. Thank you for correcting me
Scrivener's
there.
written.
Fine. Let me stop sharing and let's see. I have many things I'd like to ask. And hold on, let's just go to a gallery view, and I'll perhaps spotlight myself as well, if I can. Actually, it's happened. That doesn't matter. Good. As I say, lots of things I'd like to ask you about, but let me see if there are any questions from
Sure.
the audience. I've suggested that you type in any questions or comments you may have, but if you prefer to raise a virtual hand and talk in this small-ish group, that makes it more personal and intimate, so please feel free to do so. I'm just wondering where to start, where to put the emphasis. Perhaps we should start, and I know there are 1 or 2 dance world people in the audience. You obviously, you're not part of that world. You're speaking very much from the view of a sort of a close family member about your mother's life. But I just wonder if you could tell us a bit more detail, perhaps, about the kind of, what she did as a dancer and choreographer in her adopted home.
Well, her training was Laban training. I mean, the name is
Right.
now well
Mm-hmm.
known.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, so the 1930s, quite radical. Ausdruckstanz in German, expressive dance. It's now very widespread. So that was her training. So not classical ballet, but requiring very substantial physical strength and concentration. And in Terezin, she became very seriously ill and was told that she wouldn't dance again. She would never recover. And although the doctors in Terezin didn't know that, I mean, to her dying day, she had scars from frostbite on her feet and legs.
Mm-hmm.
However, it seems sometime in the early 50s, she discovered, I think, the Belfast Ballet Club and started going there, and then was invited to do the choreography for an ambitious school that was wanting to put on The Bartered Bride, and they were which is effectively the Czech National Opera by Smetana, and they were struggling with, to make Bohemian dances authentic. And somebody knew of her and said, well, there's this foreign lady, would she come and help? And she did. And that, in a way, was a beginning. She then was invited by an amateur theatre called the Lyric Theatre, which is now, in a sense, almost the National Theatre of Northern Ireland, the Lyric Players, to do some choreography there. And gradually began to be asked to do choreography, set up her own class, and ultimately created her own individual dance group, which started performing individual original ballets. In other words, her creativity, her ability to create returned. And over time, quite a few of those original works, it became very obvious that she was expressing experience amongst many other things. So you can see in those original ballets themes of fear, separation, loneliness, isolation, and so on and so forth. And she continued creating really until she was well into her 70s, early 80s. The very last ballet that she created was called the Ballet of Anne Frank. The theme is very obvious. And curiously enough, somehow a German dance group of young dancers in Duisburg in West Germany heard about this and invited her to go over to choreograph the ballet with them, which she did with great delight. So dance was a central part, really, of her finding herself again. And of course, through that, enormous numbers of people were influenced, friends, pupils, and it was a vehicle for her to express many, many thoughts and many emotions, which I've got to say, I mean, she didn't discuss with somebody like me at great length. Teenage boys aren't necessarily inspired by such things, but that was then. And there is a book by one of her pupils and friends, Maddie Tongue, that talks about the relationship, if you like, between her biography and her creativity.
Thank you. Is there actually anybody in the audience tonight who was either taught by her, knew her in her capacity as a dancer, or yeah, I thought you might be. You were. Would you like to unmute yourself? Sorry, I don't know your name, but please introduce yourself and let me highlight you as well. Spotlight. There we go.
My name is Brenda McKee, and I was a member of her company.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, tell us more.
Yeah, she was the most remarkable teacher, very inspirational, and eventually asked me to take over her classes, and I continued teaching after she had stopped teaching. She concentrated on the choreography more than anything else then. But she was a wonderful, wonderful teacher, and influenced a lot of people in Belfast. It was very well known.
I'm curious, did she talk to you directly about her experiences, or did that come through the dance? I mean,
that's an interesting question, because she didn't actually talk initially a lot about her experiences, and we didn't really know all that much. It was just much later on when, for example, whenever I became very friendly with her, that she would talk about her experiences late at night over a cup of coffee, and she would, refer to her experiences. So that never, the book was published. I kind of knew things in it, not everything, but parts of it.
I think it's interesting to reflect that, I mean, the book is called A Time to Speak, which clearly comes from Ecclesiastes, but it was 50 years after the events that she was chronicling. And in many ways, She had spoken previously through music, through movement, through dance. The natural form of expression for her was not the written word, but it took her that time, and the title, I think, is well chosen.
Mhm.
The implication being, presumably, Michael, that she didn't speak very much to her children. Am I right before
No,
that? Or,
we had, my brother and myself had a sort of ongoing 30-year conversation. But that was very different from committing, if you like, to paper, to something a bit more permanent, stories that existed within the family.
There's a related question from somebody called Jane. At what stage in your life did your parents speak to you about their respective experiences, and what happened to the rest of their families? You've touched on that. Did they, and also as a corollary of that, did they meet many other refugees or survivors in Belfast?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think I remember that some of the early conversations, I would have been about 12. I mean, I knew she had this tattoo, and I must have asked her, but the first serious conversations, I think, were probably just when I was on the threshold of adolescence. But Belfast had a small number of refugees and very, very few people who had had similar experiences. So, unlike what might have been the case, and it's only speculation, had she remained in Prague or had she lived in London, where there were many more people, it might have been very different. So, in a strange way, Northern Ireland was a place of peace and sanctuary. But the story over time came out. I mean, she was a bit exotic in terms of how the press viewed her. They would describe her as auburn-haired, Czech-born housewife, mother of two, which didn't really quite do justice to who she was. But she went along with that and found that quite amusing. But it took time. I don't know if that fully answers the question.
Well, it's certainly a good start, isn't it? Does anybody else have any other questions or comments at all? Yes, Bernie, go ahead.
Um, I know in her later years she gave talks, and she gave one specifically to the Jewish community, which my mother went and attended. In those days, I'd left Belfast already, but I do have the book that my mum got from the after the talk with a name inside. And so she, in her later years, presumably felt that she needed to speak more about it and really, as Michael's doing now, to relay the message of what happened.
I don't think she anticipated for one moment the reaction to the book. I mean, whether 1992, 93, there was a ceasefire beginning, whether there was some sort of spirit abroad in Northern Ireland that wanted to hear some positive things despite adversity, I don't know. But the book resonated with a lot of people for different reasons. So she was inundated with invitations to talk to education groups, church groups. That's the very first edition, from 1992. So I don't think she ever thought, I'm going to write this book and then people are going to want to hear about this all the time. I mean, that's what happened. And she then, I think, felt that she couldn't really say no. If people wanted to hear, and it took her to all sorts of places, as I think you know, including prisoners who were in what was then called Lankesh and Mays Prison, and people wanted to hear the story, and she felt an obligation to share it.
I'm looking at the time, and I'm aware that the focus, perhaps for obvious reasons, so far in your the conversation after your talk has been on your mother, and it's of course a salutary reminder. I mean, I talk blithely about my Insiders Outsiders project paying homage to the refugees from Nazi Europe, but of course, inevitably, much smaller in number. There were a precious few who did survive the very worst that life could possibly throw at anyone to tell their story and indeed to establish new lives in this part of the world. And of course, your mother is very much an example of that. But I wonder if we might just shift the focus to your very recent publication, which I read, and I said to Michael earlier on, I've just finished reading, unfortunately just a PDF, not the real print copy, but your wonderful book about your father. And I was very struck. I mean, it's full of memorable sort of phrases, and you know, the way you tell the story is hugely engaging. But I was struck by one particular, I think it's in the afterward. You said very succinctly, I never met Dr. Harry Lewy, but I did know Mr. Harry Lewis. And it seemed to me to sum up, certainly again, I don't want to get too personal, but my own experience of my father and the way I knew him, but didn't actually know him. He came from Poland as a young man just before the war. Tell us a little bit more about the process of writing, because one of the things that struck me forcibly about your book is the way that you put yourself in your father's shoe incredibly convincingly, and yet you are not your father. And tell us more about the process of writing it, or of thinking about it first and then writing it.
I had a story I wanted to tell. I didn't set out to write a book at all. And behind that was a feeling that for all Mum's celebrity, it wasn't the complete story, that my father was a critical figure in making possible what she was able to achieve. And it wasn't that she didn't acknowledge that or downplayed it. I mean, he was a quiet, modest, fairly self-effacing person with a dry sense of humor. But people used to say, and Brenda and other people who knew her will know this, I mean, people used to say to her, you must have been enormously brave, courageous to survive all that. And she resisted very forcibly the idea that her survival had anything to do with personal qualities, least all of bravery or courage. And she would explain that to believe that somehow implies, however unintentionally, that people who didn't survive were somehow deficient in some quality or other. So she resisted that. After she had died, I mean, it kept turning over in my mind that there was a bravery, but the bravery, and it's quite difficult to explain, but the bravery was to continue to live. You know, she was 29, her health was wrecked. She had lost her mother, her husband, his family, her family members. What was there to live for? And into that came my father. And I think his role was actually central in making it possible for her to re-establish herself, to, there's a German phrase, to find an existence, to underpin a new life. And that was the role that he took on, very unassumingly. So that played on my mind. Then I started writing and got a lot of advice from one or two people about put this in, take that out. And I had some sources on which to draw. I mean, there were family stories, there were some documents, there's a lot of published history. And then I have to say there were bits where I had to dramatize, you know, they didn't have smartphones and constant recording of some of those conversations. So some of that is drawing on the man I knew and fleshing out episodes that he talked about. And it was a process of constant revision. I mean, I don't regard myself as a writer. I happen to have told a story. It's now, you know, become a book, so it changes slightly. But the process was, it was a process of discovery to some extent. Maybe I'm deluding myself, but I feel I know my father better now. I mean, we had a very good relationship. We had a close, warm, very secure, loving family relationship as a family. But maybe I'm deluding myself, but I somehow feel that I know the man better because I've needed to empathize with things that I hadn't needed to think about and to try and work out what did that feel like. Now, a lot of memoir or a lot of documentary writing describes the facts, and sometimes in fabulous detail, trying to imagine what it might have felt like to be adrift, to be in limbo, to not have a future, to not know whether you would ever see your parents again. So not reading history backwards, but trying to think myself into that became sort of part of what I was trying to do. Whether it works or not, and whether it crosses a threshold, well, that's for others to say. I mean, I think the story is authentic in the sense that I think these feelings and emotions and sense of loss, so on, I think are quite genuine. Whether he would have used the same words on every occasion, well, who knows?
No, it's
I don't know if that's answered the.
No, it does. It's utterly convincing. I mean, it's almost as though he had written it himself, which of course he didn't. So I'm just wondering, again, thinking about the implications of what you've done, it reads almost like fiction, totally engrossing, totally convincing. Did it ever feel slightly presumptuous, or perhaps going a step too far to kind of indeed imagine or fill in the gaps in your knowledge in the telling of his story?
I was very anxious not to piggyback the story on Mum's story.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I resisted tying the two in any way together. And there was one or two friends who said, look, you really need to, you need to see where these things hang together. So is it, I don't know, Monica, I'll have to rethink whether I've been presumptuous.
I'm just thinking that's not a criticism.
I know what you mean.
No, it's it's just wondering.
I mean, there were things that were in earlier drafts that came out with the very tactful and I think sound advice, particularly of my wife, that I think if they'd been in, they would have probably crossed a line into the presumptuous. They would have been more about me, actually, than about the subject of the story.
Well, it's a huge, I don't know how many of you in the audience have actually read it, and perhaps we do need to draw things to a close shortly, but just to repeat the title, Flight from Prague, The Making of a Refugee, recently published in September, available through the publisher's website, Haythorpe, Haythorp books, or Amazon as well, yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm
delighted. Sorry, I'm delighted to hear that your mother's A Time to Speak, first published in 1992, has been reissued. So that's an extraordinary read, of course. So any last chance? Any more questions? No. Okay. Much to think about there. Thank you so much, Michael. And as I did mention, it always happens, I'm afraid, with free events that people sign up and don't actually log on the day. Nice comment from Annette. Thank you very much. It's such an inspiring story. Here. But the event has been recorded, and the recording will, within the next few days, go on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you may, if you're not familiar with it, you may like to take a look at, because it has talks by members of the second generation and indeed third generation sometimes, but on a whole array of different topics, on internment, on different art forms, many different perspectives, including, in fact, dance as well. And I'm thinking, Michael, maybe when we do an event in the new year focusing on Northern Ireland, we'll bring your mother back into the picture, as it were, perhaps more in that professional sense of her contribution as a dancer and choreographer, but that's for the future. And much more to come in the new year. We have one talk actually already next week, which will be an in conversation between myself and the authors of two recent books, Owen Hatherley and Busu Dogramachi. Probably got that pronunciation wrong. Both of them on the bigger topic of the émigré contribution to British culture, particularly focusing on the 1930s and 1940s generation. So you might like to sign up for that. And if you'd like to know more about future activities, if you go to the insidersoutsiders.org website, and at the bottom right of the homepage, if you sign up, it takes only a few minutes to do so, to receive the not entirely regular, but they keep on coming, the newsletters, which will give you information about forthcoming events. That would be great. So I think that's probably enough for the moment. Seamus, again, saying thank you, and Robin. Lovely, Michael, I hope to keep in touch with you, and I do recommend, if you haven't read both books, please do, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel very, very privileged.
Pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good night, everyone.